Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Energy Africa Café, a podcast series dedicated to giving young energy professionals a glimpse into the future through the experiences and, of course, insights of professionals. My name is Rebecca Agadumo, and today I'll be your host. I'm quite excited about that. Even more excited because we have a very, very seasoned professional in the studio with us today, and it's going to be an interesting ride. I can tell you guys that for sure. Today, I have with me the very delectable Miss Regina Miller. Hi, Miss Regina Miller. We're so excited to have you on the call with us. Thank you for joining in.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Rebecca.
Thank you so much. I am super excited to read out your bio because it is a mouthful. It already tells me the amount of experience and the amount of insight we're about to dig into. So I'm just going to go right into it. Miss Regina Miller serves as a senior energy specialist at the World Bank in Ouagadougou, where she leads the energy portfolio and sector dialogue for the World Bank in Burkina Faso. Throughout her career, she, a Nigerian national, has partnered with governments across more than 20 developing countries to design and implement energy projects that accelerate global energy access through clean technologies and renewable solutions. Ms. Miller specializes in gender-sensitive investment and innovative approaches that strengthen private sector engagement and energy resilience. Her extensive international development experience spans West Africa, Central Asia, and Eastern Europe. As part of the Climate Investment Fund, she supported the administration of over $8.5 billion at the World Bank headquarters in Washington, D.C. During her secondment to the African Development Bank as a senior renewable energy specialist, she coordinated the Desert to Power initiative, working towards 10 gigawatts of new solar capacity to electrify 250 million people across 11 Sahel countries. Miller holds an MBA from the University of Phoenix and graduates certificate in renewable energy sustainability systems with a focus on solar engineering. She remains driven by her passion for renewable energy and her commitment to sustainable electrification as a catalyst for equitable economic growth in Africa. Ladies and gentlemen, I am excited to present to you Miss Miller. Welcome to the show, Miss Miller.
Thank you so much. You make me sound so much better than I am.
No. I definitely had no hand in this. I'm just reading out what you already did, and I am so excited. I remember looking through your biography, and I'm just like, what a woman. And it's so interesting again that it's March, and March is considered the Women's Month, which I definitely feel like should be all year round. But it's so interesting to be able to have a conversation with you in this month. I think it's not just interesting, it's very, very important that we're having this conversation in this month. And I would like to kick off my very first question. You can see your experience across 20 developing countries. That is extensive, right? Your career has taken you across more than 20 developing countries, working on energy projects that bridge the gap between clean technologies and real-world implementation, right? And it's interesting because there are a lot of young Africans that are eager to work in renewable energy, but often find the sector quite difficult or sometimes confusing to access. And my first question will definitely be, what practical steps can aspiring professionals take to break into the industry? How do you provide pathways through your organizations that you currently work in, such as World Bank? How do they provide pathways that young talents can come in? If you can give us some practical steps and just a little bit of your experience, that would be fantastic for our listeners.
Sure. Thank you so much, Rebecca. And thanks for highlighting a very important fact, the fact that this is International Women's Month. As you said, women should definitely be celebrated every single day of the year, but it's good to have this special time for, carved out just to make women feel special, for us to talk about our issues, talk about our challenges, talk about our dreams, and really move forward collectively as women, especially as women in Africa. So it's a pleasure for me to be here, not just on any month, but on this special month. And thanks for your question. You are right. I receive messages on LinkedIn all the time from young professionals saying, hey, it's hard to get into this field. What do I do? How do I make it? Energy can be very technical. You have the transmission lines, distribution lines, you can get more engineering of it. And there is probably harder for people who don't have the training or the education. But the good thing about renewable energy is that it's very, very adaptable. It's very diverse. You can look at renewable energy, especially energy access from different perspectives that are very easy for even the professionals who are not engineers to come into. But if I were speaking to young professionals who want to make it into the energy sector, some of whom maybe already have the skills, some of whom may not have the skills, I would give maybe 5 general points of advice. The first thing you do is that you need to gain the knowledge. You have to build the knowledge and the skills. And that will also help professionals to know what they like and what they don't like. They may decide, all right, well, actually the energy engineering may not be for me. Renewable energy engineering may not be my passion, but maybe connecting people to electricity is my passion. And so maybe you're looking more in the off-grid space. So you can develop technical skills in solar PV, in wind, in mini grids. There's also battery storage. I mean, in the full value chain of energy access and renewable energy, there are lots of things that one can learn to do and learn to do better. So this basic knowledge helps. There's also the importance of being familiar with local policies, because you live in Nigeria, you live in West Africa, you need to be familiar with what the challenges are in your country, what are the market trends, where are the opportunities. So I think for young people, this first point about building your knowledge and gaining knowledge, both formal and informal, is important. The second one is about gaining practical experience. And sometimes we make the mistake of thinking that you have to have a job to do this. You have to have a formal offer of a job to do this. But there are volunteer opportunities. You have tons of NGOs, startups, government programs that are looking for volunteers, for example. Having finished the course, the next logical step I would encourage one to do is to find a way to get involved in doing what you've learned to do, put it to work, and you can learn in that way from other people who have more experience, and you can actually get hands-on experience through volunteer opportunities. Increasingly, even development organizations like the one I work for are leaning more towards community-based interventions. So communities are encouraged now to think of the energy solutions that work best for them, instead of waiting for the government to come up with an extension of the grid or to bring the grid to the national grid to their homes. And so one can also join the communities in thinking through what energy solutions can be more adaptable to them. There are research universities, initiatives that you can also volunteer with. And there's actually certification programs. I know that ECRI is the ECOWAS Center for Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency. ECRI does have a solar certification program. When I was in the AFDB, we supported them on this, and I know that this is still going on. And so these are things that one can practically use to get practical experience. The third thing I would mention is to expand your network. And I think, what we're doing here is one of that, right? We're connecting people, but there's also, forums that one can participate in. And most of these are not paid conferences. You have SE for All that has networks as well for renewable energy, for energy access. You have local renewable energy associations that do everything from even those who do solar installations to those who support renewable energy policy in several ways. And so finding mentors, expanding networks, that is definitely something that young people and anyone who is interested at any age to make it in the energy sector should want to explore. Maybe I would say as a fourth point, the point of innovation. We make the mistake sometimes of thinking that we have to have a fancy degree to be able to innovate. The first point of innovation is a problem. And once we have the mindset that we want to help solve a problem, then the next thing we ought to do is to find a way to innovate to solve that issue. I'll give an example. I went to a secondary school in the bush. I would say it was a missionary school. But I had a classmate who developed the first biomass electricity generator that I had ever seen. And this guy was just 12 years old. So he basically collected waste, both human and animal waste, and he used it to design a system that would generate electricity. He did not have a fancy degree, but the only thing we had is that we had a problem, right? And so if you have that focus on wanting to solve problems, that problem solving approach would lead to innovation. It just means that you may have to try and fail and learn from that failure and try again. But if one is interested in launching a business, for example, having gained knowledge, having done work with mentors and having followed through the steps to associate with networks and all of that, there are innovation funds actually that exist through even the World Bank, for example. There's the Africa Energy Innovation Challenge that is also there. The African Development Bank also has a few innovation programs, and even within each country, if you research, if you contact the ministries of energy, the agencies in charge of renewable energy or rural electrification, they may be able to share information about energy access, clean cooking, which is also very much linked to energy access as well. But they may be able to share information about fellowships or funds or scholarships or, even crowdsourcing is an option that one could look into if you have a viable, business idea that you want to pursue. So I guess the point is just to encourage people to persist and follow through. And that's linked to my fifth and final point, which is that you need to stay persistent. You need to stay adaptable. Because quite frankly, the energy sector is one that evolves very, very quickly. And we all need to stay curious. I learn every day. I learn every day from the people I work with. I learn every day from my government partners. So as professionals, we need to stay agile, which means we need to be adaptable. It means that we need to learn new skills if we have to. I learned French along the way because I knew that it would serve me one day. I'm still not a perfect French speaker, but I speak enough French to be able to work in a French country. So as an Anglophone, I would encourage everyone to learn a language, change your skills, learn new skills if necessary, but just be adaptable and stay curious. So those are maybe the 5 points that I would highlight: gaining knowledge, gaining experience, expanding networks, innovating, and staying agile. Yeah.
Wow, that was, and I mean that because I think about me 2, 3 couple of years ago, just starting out in the energy sector and not knowing where to start out from. And the points you listed were really what I ended up with after the hours of research. So I'm pretty sure our listeners, aspiring professionals, have definitely gained a lot just listening to those points. And I'm so excited that you shared them in steps. Okay, I want to go to my second questions. I feel like my second question is more for a different set of individuals. So first question was for people trying to get into the industry. But my next question is more for people who are already in the industry, right? So having worked across a range of regions within the West Africa and central part of Africa, you've gained invaluable experience. We've seen from my first question, navigating different market dynamics. What would you say are some of the common missteps that professionals make when working on renewable energy projects in developing markets? And how can we mitigate these challenges, especially in the context of Africa's diverse energy needs?
Thanks for that question. So my career has taken me across different regions. I've worked in Europe and Central Asia. I've worked in a little bit in Latin America. I've worked across Africa in different sub-regions of the continent. And, as an energy professional, I have to say that every country is different. Every market is different. And the needs are definitely different from one part of the world to another. And so probably the points we can reflect on together will be for professionals as a whole, but maybe even for countries as well. So I think one of the major things that we have to recognize is that, like I said, every country is different and the challenges are different. And where each country is at in its energy development is quite different as well. So the clients that we worked with in countries like Eastern Europe, or even in Central Asia, in Turkey, these are clients that have gone through, they've had a longer learning curve. They've decided on what they want to do. And so where organizations like the World Bank come in is just to partner, right? The mistake we make when we come back to Africa is that we feel that because we've done this in Turkey, we've done this in Estonia or in Poland or Ukraine, it should definitely work in Africa. The one size fits all approach, I tell you, is the one thing
Definitely doesn't work.
Exactly. It does not work.
Yeah.
You can't assume that solutions that worked in developed markets will work identically in developing economies. We have to really consider the local context. So without considering the local context, we risk, even as professionals, bringing solutions that are not adaptable to the countries themselves that we're working in. It means then that we're not really listening to our clients as well, because the countries are our clients, right? But maybe another misstep that we make when we're working, especially in an African context, is really underestimating the infrastructure challenges. So take Nigeria, for example. Nigeria has rich energy resources, right? You have gas, you have oil, you have hydro, you have solar, you have wind. So Nigeria has the full, any kind of energy potential that you can list in the world. Nigeria has it, right? But we do have challenges. We have challenges with policy framework. We have challenges, especially with the infrastructure. There's a major infrastructure challenge. And so I'll give you a practical experience. You go into a country and you say, wow, we're all about renewable energy. Let's make renewable energy work. Let's bring in the private sector to build solar power plants. Let's bring in the private sector to invest in this. And we as a World Bank Group, we will guarantee it and make sure that the government meets its obligations. But sometimes we forget that you can generate this electricity, but you actually have to take it to homes. And so you have your transmission network, you have your distribution network to consider. So if we don't account for grid limitations and last mile distribution challenges, then we risk making mistakes even when we have a development focus in mind. And so these are some things that we need to look at. But even beyond that, right? Planning is very essential, especially for developing countries. One thing that is common in our developing countries is change. You would find that governments, people you work with in the government change, your ministers change often, heads of agencies would change, and it's mostly driven by political decisions. But if you do not have, as a country, a solid energy sector planning document, what will happen is that every government will come in with a new vision. You have, I think, you in Nigeria, I'll take Nigeria as an example, you have your Vision 2030. Well, 2030 is close. All right. Vision 2030. Changing and rejigging the vision every time. But what we should be doing instead is preparing a solid energy sector master plan or a least cost plan, and we stick to it, right? It contains scenarios that says, all right, if we succeed in maybe interconnecting with another country, what will we change? What kind of energy decisions will we make at that point? But in any case, the planning becomes sacrosanct in the sense that every government that comes maintains that plan and continues the plan instead of recreating the plan over and over again. I think that also, especially when we're working in an African context, we really underestimate the socioeconomic realities. Sometimes a report that a consultant has prepared looks really good, and it says, if you do X, Y, Z, then this will happen. Quite frankly, we don't consider affordability. You have to consider affordability. These solutions that you're inviting the private sector to come and bring to the communities, and they actually afford it. And if they can't afford it, will there be subsidies that Congress can provide? Then all of these things need to be considered. But if we do not have, I had mentioned in responding to the first question, the focus on community-based approaches. If we do not have a focus on really talking to communities and working with communities, we will miss it. Because if we're having a top-down approach where people in the capitals are making decisions for community without appropriate engagement with these benefiting communities, then we will miss the mark as well. So I mean, there are capacity gaps on every front. And these challenges and maybe some of these professional missteps are there as well and need to be considered. But there are opportunities as well. Africa is diverse. Yes. Africa has different energy needs and contexts. I mean, you can look at East Africa versus North Africa versus West Africa. The challenges are different, right, from each part of the continent. But you can have the opportunity there to embrace diversity of solutions. So if we have that mindset, then we can easily say, it doesn't matter if it's worked in Morocco or not. Is this adaptable to Burkina Faso? Are the conditions right? Burkina Faso is a landlocked country. Are we making assumptions that are not true? So I think the fact that we are developing as a continent, it gives opportunities to embrace diversity in terms of the solutions that we're bringing. and to build local partnerships as well. You can build capacity, train local technicians to do things cheaper instead of hiring an international firm, for example. I live and work in Burkina Faso, in Ouagadougou. Really, really amazing people, very resilient despite the many challenges that the country is facing. But the one thing that this country and most of our African countries are really focusing on now is local content, right? They want to build the energy sector within their countries, right? Developing partners like us, we've historically mostly worked with international firms that would come and implement projects in developing countries. But most times you would find that these international firms will hire subcontractors to do the main work, right? They may bring the technical know-how, but the subcontractors are actually the ones doing the work on the ground. So I think countries like Burkina Faso now are thinking, why don't you flip it? Why don't you build the capacity in-house so that we can do these things ourselves without needing the international firms? And the World Bank, the international partners are adapting to that as well. And so partnering with institutions for long-term knowledge transfer, I think, is the focus now. And this is where it stands, I still believe, as an opportunity for Africa. I've talked about engaging communities. We need to do meaningful engagement, not come and bring solutions that are already pre-cooked. But we have to work with communities to design solutions that are adapted to their governance structures, to their capacity, to what they can afford. I mean, there are many things. Yeah. So, I mean, I can talk all day about this. These are the same things that we talk about every day in my work. But, I'd like to see these things as opportunities rather than as risks. And I think that's mindsets that we should always have.
I think that's a brilliant response, honestly, Regina. I think for me, one thing that stood out is having African solutions that are built within the African context. Interesting conversation so far. Question. I feel like I already mentioned this at the start of the podcast, right? This is March. Everyone knows March is Women's Month, but the rest of the year can be ours too. But my third question really focuses on that. And I'm happy that I'm asking you this question because I can already feel your passion for women in the industry and just at large. So I would say one of your areas of expertise is gender sensitive investment and the role of women in Africa's energy transition, right? But despite the increasing attention on gender inclusion, leadership in this sector is still pretty much male-dominated. We can all agree on that. So what would you say are strategies that work best in ensuring that more women are actively involved in shaping energy policies and projects? And I would be happy if you can also share a personal experience where gender dynamics influenced your approach to leadership or general project execution.
Certainly, this is a very interesting question and a timely one too, considering the one thing I want to say is that in any economy, I think any economist in any country, especially in developing countries, will agree with the fact that women run economies.
True.
So you will have the formal economies, but especially in the African context, the more powerful ones in some cases is the informal economies. And this is where women are the backbone mostly of informal economies. We saw this with our mothers. We see it every day on the streets and we see how much women push. It's no different in the energy sector. The energy sector is one that is male dominated, as you said, and this is the truth. I find myself being a minority in some meetings I sit in. And it's not because you don't have qualified women. I know excellent women engineers, women who are passionate and work in the sector as well. But I think there's a general recognition that we need to do more to bring women to the table. We need to do more to increase the gender focus. And when we say gender, we don't want to be gender compliant as just only, we want to be inclusive. I think the definition of being inclusive has been changing over time. Not just giving women a seat at the table. It's not just including them, but also considering what they say, right? You have to really listen, actively listen and adapt their solutions. And before I go into strategies and all of that, I'll probably give one clear example. And I'll give the example of clean cooking, right? So some of the major pollutants that we have in most countries is the fact that we're cooking with wood. Not only is it leading to deforestation, you have countries that are in conflict situations where the only choice that people have is to just go to the forest or whatever, they have a wooded area cut wood to cook. And as women go to source for wood, they're exposed as well to violence. And the wood cooking also brings about a lot of secondary health risks and other issues that really affect climate generally. Also, I had a learning moment recently where we had a clean cooking workshop here in Burkina Faso, and we had a room full of really, really great professionals coming with excellent ideas about clean and how to adopt clean cooking for Burkinabes. And I'm saying this just because this is where I work right now. And quite frankly, I saw that from a development focus, we need to listen to the women. And when they were going through the different projects that they had implemented with development partners, one thing that became clear is that if you do not bring the women to the table when you're discussing and even creating solutions for them, it will never work. A clear example came when it had to do with a clean cooking stove that was financed and purchased at large scale by one of the developing partners that worked here. This is an older project. But they realized that these clean cooking stoves were not being used. And later on, and it was properly designed, they did consultations, did all of that. But in the design itself of the main solution, they failed to recognize that there are some meals that you prepare that if you don't, you're Nigerians, you know the smell of the jollof rice, right? It changes it altogether when you're using a clean cooking solution. Some clean cooking solutions, there are some meals that African women prepare that you need to stand to make those meals. If you sit down, it changes the meal altogether, and vice versa, So, taking most of this cultural context into consideration, especially when designing solutions that directly impact women, you need to include them as part of the solutions, and not just discussing the solutions, but really listening to what they're saying, observing what they do, and implementing that as part of the solution on the technical side as well. So, but generally, when we talk about strategies for enhancing women involvement, in energy policy, I think there are key things that we can do and that we can do better. The first thing is education and capacity building. I'm speaking constantly with institutions of higher learning that say, all right, we graduate X amount of women, X percentage of our class are women, but in the workforce, we find that there are fewer women in this field. And one asks the question, why, right? So I think we need to be more conscious of the cultural challenges that women face. And this differs from country to country. It differs from context, specific social context to another context in another country. So I think we need to provide specialized education and training programs in energy policy, in renewable energy, and related technical fields that really target women. And when you're building these policy solutions with women in mind, I think it's definitely different than when you're doing it generally for the general population. And this is something that we all need to take into consideration. There are mentorship programs as well that we can look into. We can build more mentorship programs that really involves pairing female energy engineers with emerging leaders. We have, at least at the World Bank, we do have internship programs. We have mentorship programs as well. And what you're doing right now, I think this is one of those that we should definitely do more of. We should develop scholarships that are specifically targeting women. Most times the men put themselves forward more easily and more readily for these opportunities than women do. So we should have as targets really inviting women and measuring progress in terms of how many women participate in fellowship programs and scholarship programs and other educational incentives, especially in the energy field as well. When we talk about institutional reform, the second point I had was around that, because for us, energy policy is very much linked to institutional reform. But when we talk about energy policies and we talk about regulatory bodies and we talk about ministry positions, most of these are outlined by men. I'm actually encouraged by the Sahel countries that I work in, and I'm seeing more female participation, but there's still a lot to do. I work as well I worked in Niger and even in Mali, where some of the key positions were occupied by dynamic women who really brought the gender focus into energy policies. who would say, you know, really, when you design something, even the height of it, women are not as tall as men, and men are quite tall in this part of the world. You know, a simple thing as putting this at the height that everyone can reach, both the men and the women. It's a very simple, it looks like a simple thing, but it could be a game changer when you're talking about practical solutions. We should definitely have more energy caucuses, women in energy groups. I'm encouraged to see that such groups exist. The World Bank just finished early this week, Women in Energy Conference in Cote d'Ivoire, attended by so many women professionals who took the opportunity to discuss the specific challenges for women professionals in the energy sector. We need to implement gender-responsive budgeting for energy initiatives. You know, even in the energy sector, we go to the field most of the times to visit solar plants and all of that. They barely do not have shoes that fit women. Most of the shoes that are provided, even for people who just drop in, are oversized, because even in procurement, we don't have gender-focused procurement challenges. Women's heads are different from men, and we have hair and all of those things. So even in institutional reforms, there are simple things that you can do: gender-responsive budgeting, can do gender-responsive procurement that could change, you know, a woman's comfort level when she's in an office or she's working in the sector. There are other things that we could do. You know, we can fund gender-specific research on specific energy needs and consumption patterns. I'll give an example of here in Burkina Faso, where we're looking a lot at productive use of energy and activities that generate revenue that could be supported by renewable energy. You would find that in most of the sectors like shea butter, which is very prominent here, cashew, chicken rearing as a business, most of them are run by women. And so when you're looking at productive use, a practical thing to do would be to speak with these women, right? What kind of credit or financing solutions would be more adapted to women? As women, you would be surprised to find, just speaking to a few women, I was surprised to find that they already have, you know, I think you have different names for it, but in Nigeria, in the northern Nigeria where I grew up, it's called Adashi. It's this kind of style financing. But yeah, women in business do that too. You know, they open to financing structures where they say, look, we don't want to take credit for us to get energy solutions, but we're happy to put some money aside every month. And when we reach a specific threshold, you can add a subsidy from the World Bank, from any other international partner. You can add a subsidy and I get my energy solution. And they're very, very clear about what it brings to their business. So I think really giving visibility to gender-focused energy and consumption solutions, I think this is something that can easily make a difference in women's participation. Just before I conclude on this question, I really want to talk about grassroots engagement. If we're looking at rural electrification, and in most countries, developing countries, especially in Africa, you would find that rural energy access is much lower than the urban energy access. There's usually a focus on the urban areas, but in the rural areas, especially in countries, you know, in West Africa, especially that are landlocked, that are very, very geographically large, you would have communities that are far from the grid, where sometimes it doesn't even make sense to build a transmission or distribution line to go to these communities. You need solutions that are adapted to grassroots needs, and which means that you have the opportunity to train energy ambassadors within the country. Burkina Faso had a program funded by an international donor that had what they call solar grandmothers. They essentially trained older women in communities to repair solar components. So these things make a whole difference. You bridge the local needs with policy development, right? You have women-led society organizations focused on rural access that you can support. These are things that generally, I do feel that at an international level, we speak a lot about gender inclusion, but there's still more that we've all collectively as an international development community been trying to promote. And these are some of them, you know, the grassroots engagement, visibility for women, empowering women economically and financially as well, involving women in institutional reform, and definitely more education and capacity building that is focused on women.
I love your response. But I think it's so interesting, your take on each of these questions, and particularly the one we just responded to, because I am of the opinion that no solution is actually complete if women were not considered. Because just like you mentioned, at the grassroots level, women really are the ones leading those spaces. So if we're going to create solutions for them, and what they think, how they feel about the solutions, what they even think they require, are not considered, then who are we building the solutions for in the first place? But yeah, I definitely enjoyed your response to that question. And now I'm down to my last question. So my last question is more focused on your role at the World Bank. Throughout our conversations, you've touched on a couple of things, right? But focusing on your role at the World Bank, you've worked closely with governmental stakeholders to design and implement projects that expand global energy access through clean technologies and renewable solutions, which means you often navigate complex regulatory and financial landscapes. So from your experience, what would you say are the most significant policy and funding challenges that hinder energy access? Additionally, I would say, what innovative financing mechanisms or policy shifts, right, have you seen that successfully de-risk investment and accelerated clean energy deployment in this challenging environment?
So maybe I'll start with the policy challenges. So when we talk about energy access, I think everyone agrees that the fact that there's electricity in my community and there's no electricity in my home does not mean I have energy access. You know, on the policy side, when you're counting access and you say that electricity has been, brought to this village, so I'm assuming that everyone in the village has access. That may not always be correct. So energy access is something that's defined differently, at least on the point about connecting, the connections that give electricity. In terms of energy access, different countries have different definitions, and even the development partners look at this also from a different perspective, right? How much energy would be considered access? If I have a solar lamp that allows me to see at night, doesn't mean I have energy access. Do I need to have a stove, a fridge, a fan, a radio? So what level of electricity do I need to have for me to be considered as having access to electricity or to energy? So I think these are policy questions that every country will need to answer for itself. And because the needs are different and because the goals are different, it needs to be adapted to each country, right? But the main thing in terms of policy challenges that really hinder that discussion is the regulatory frameworks. In the energy sector, you need to have a strong regulator. And usually the role of the regulator is to keep everyone happy, essentially to give everyone reassurances that their rights are being looked out for, both the consumers, both the investors, and even the government itself. And in cases where things do not go well, the regulator steps in to say, okay, this is what the law says. You don't think of your regulator as your amiable mediator that steps in and settles some of these issues when they arise. So regulatory frameworks sometimes are really, really outdated in some countries. And sometimes even when they exist, they are not always very effective. And so I think one of the major challenges in terms of policy is really building robust regulatory frameworks. More than likely, you will find in most countries that when we talk about regulation, we're mostly focused on grid access, meaning electricity that comes from wires and cables, right? It's like a grid network that's supplying the electricity. But we forget decentralized solutions like mini grids, like solar kits, solar home systems, rooftop solar, and other solutions that expand access to underserved areas without following the traditional approach. And so when you have regulatory frameworks that are not robust enough to capture regulation also in terms of all of this, then you start to have issues in energy access. And some of the issues very practically is if everybody can supply you with solar equipment, and you have no control, you have no regulatory control about the quality of the equipment that are coming in, about service standards, then it means that you will have a market flooded with substandard products. And so if someone takes their hard-earned money to buy a solar kit that includes a lamp, a TV, a radio, and a charger, a charging point, and after 2 months, it stops working. How would you explain that? So as a country, you need to protect your consumers as well, and you need to protect your citizens by making sure that you have strong policies that ensures that equipment, even at an equipment level, equipments that come in go through some kind of standards tests that is really, really enforced. Because there's one thing to have regulations, is another thing to enforce them. So I think that's one thing that we need to look at as a policy challenge in terms of regulation. The second one that we really have experienced is political instability. And I think that, most of us in West Africa, essentially, we are familiar with this challenge because governance issues in some areas make it difficult to create investment certainty. And where investors are not sure of what the long-term focus or long-term goals are, or the long-term perspectives in terms of the politics of the country, they prefer to take a more risk-averse approach. So, I think that this is one thing that really hinders policy frameworks and hinders actually access to electricity sometimes, because if we can't create the right conditions for investors to come into Africa, then it would be difficult for us to meet the energy access gap, essentially. So maybe other policy challenges that we've seen, I've talked about planning earlier on. So if you do not have an energy policy that is founded on a strong energy planning, then you would have issues. And sometimes, and maybe this is more in some countries more than others, but you have land rights issues and permitting issues as well, especially in rural areas where you have land that is sacred. You can't at the national level take decisions that you're going to put in massive power plants without consulting the community in an area where there are customs and, religious considerations, for example, that make land sacred. And that's why organizations like ours, we have environmental and social safeguards requirements that really make sure that we understand very well all of the environmental and the social considerations before investment decisions are made. But if you have countries where you have complex land use regulations, you have complex permitting processes, all of this will delay and even sometimes prevent energy infrastructure development. So this is something that we really need to look at as well. And really, the low-hanging fruit that really poses a challenge is a silos approach. And I would say this really clearly, because sometimes, even when we're rushing forward as countries to invest in energy, to meet the energy access challenge, we forget that we need to coordinate, right? We need to coordinate between energy and water. There's a nexus there. We need to coordinate between energy and agriculture. There's also a nexus there that is important. There's also a joint nexus between energy, water, and agriculture that is linked as well and needs to be coordinated. And this means working across different ministries. Most of our governments are really not catered to coordinate and communicate between each other. Energy is not so much, it's not just a technical discussion, it's also a social, is also an economic development discussion as well. Energy is linked to every aspect of an economy. Because if you're looking at energy as a product by itself, you're missing the opportunity to see how energy touches every single aspect, both education, health, transport, every other sector is touched by the energy sector. And so if we have a fragmented approach to policy or to implementation of projects, then we find that we're facing challenges in terms of success. Tammy, there are several other policy challenges that affect energy and clean cooking solutions, especially where access is concerned, and even renewable energy. But these are some of the main ones that I can mention off the top of my head at this moment. But now taking this to the second part of the question about funding challenges, wow. The energy sector is not cheap. I can tell you that, especially when you're trying to do big stuff. You're building solar power plants, you're building wind turbines, you're building other sources, gas power plants, and you're building other sources of energy as well. It is expensive. And it's not just building them, but you have to also evacuate whatever you're producing in terms of the energy as electricity to homes. So some of the funding challenges, the major one is the high upfront cost for capital. So even mini grids, that, you have a community that has 100 homes. You really don't need a grid-linked solution. You need maybe a mini grid or even a microgrid to meet their energy needs. But you will find that most of these grids are expensive. Mini grids are not cheap, especially if you have to have storage. And of course, as someone who is passionate about renewable energy, I'm almost always in favor of green mini grids, which means that in the daytime, your solar panels are producing electricity. But in the nighttime, you have two options. You either have to store the energy you're getting, some part of the energy you're getting in the daytime, or you have to use a generator. And more than often, you would find that mini grids are supplemented with your traditional generators. And which use diesel and fuel and things like that. So green mini grids are usually the way to go, where you have batteries that are storing energy during the daytime, but these are really, really expensive. It increases the investment costs. And this, especially when you're in a low resource environment, this becomes a killer sometimes. So the high upfront cost, especially capital cost, is a problem. On the policy side, there are policies indicating how much people will pay for electricity, right? So a private sector that is coming to invest in energy cannot set a price. Ideally, they should be able to set the price that helps them recover their costs. But sometimes they're limited by regulatory policies that says, no, you can't charge more than X amount per kilowatt hour. And sorry if I'm going too technical, but you pay for electricity, you cannot charge too much for it because it's a social service as well as far as governments are concerned. So I think there's that disconnect between costs and profits that makes it sometimes difficult for the private sector. I talked about political uncertainties, but it's also a funding challenge as well, because there's a perception of high risk, right? Where there's political instability, if people are not sure of where the country is going, a client's country is going, it's hard for them to invest. We're really trying to attract investors that will bring hundreds of millions of dollars or whatever local currency to build power plants and to stay back and manage them and all of that. But if they feel that there's high risk, really oftentimes limits the amount of investments that you're able to mobilize from the private sector. And I know that institutions like the World Bank, we have our private sector side of things, which is the IFC. We have the guarantees part of it, which is called MEGA. They come with, and all the development institutions as well, the AFDB included, come with these packages that kind of reduce the risk and reduce the perception of risk and take on some of these risks to encourage private sector investment. And this helps quite a bit. But the higher financing cost still remains a risk in most of our countries. Another funding challenge is limited public funding, because government budgets are constrained, especially in developing countries. You can't expect that the government will invest most of its resources in energy, because it does have other challenges, other competing sectors as well that need investment. So the limited public funding is usually a key challenge. And I know that development partners also come with funding to help support public funding as well. But still, I think the need is what's very clear is that the need largely surpasses the availability of funds. I mean, there's other funding challenges like the last mile financing gap. I had mentioned that you will have sometimes communities where electricity has arrived in the community, but there are some homes that cannot afford a meter. So they're looking at their neighbors with electricity, but they don't have electricity. So these last mile financing gaps, it increases dramatically, especially in rural areas where income levels are very low. And so you need to keep that in mind, at least when I'm designing programs. I always try to think of, okay, what does this mean for the people who eventually will be benefiting from this electricity, and how can you support them? So this last mile financing gaps, I think this is something as well that needs to be looked at as a major funding challenge, especially for poorer households. Honestly, the one thing, I don't know if I should mention this, but I just feel that probably something that we can consider as well. We all have, especially in the energy sector, most people have short-term investment horizons. Most times when you invest in renewable energy, your returns are not immediate. It's expensive when you start. But then you will find that over time, your costs will start to reduce, but you have to wait for that break-even period. And so it becomes a funding challenge. If I, as a person, I can afford to get rooftop solar, my salary, I can afford it. But when I look at it, I'm going to essentially be paying what I would pay for traditional electricity for 2 years. I would pay it in one go as a down payment even. So the initial capital investments, especially in clean energy, is a lot. And so if we're looking at short-term benefits, it would not be realistic, because sometimes some of them have longer payback periods before you start getting really, really good benefits. Sometimes it's in year 5, sometimes it's in year 10, but between the year 0 to year 5 or year 10, it just feels like a lot of money is going into an investment. So clean energy is not cheap, just to keep that in mind. But it becomes a funding challenge when you don't have opportunities. Now, how do you turn all of this into positive? Because I like to look at the positive side of things. How do you turn all of these into opportunities? I think recognizing these challenges upfront gives a good ground for negotiating, right? And I'm speaking not as staff of a development organization, but as an African as well. I really feel that if governments have a clear idea of what their challenges are, they're able to negotiate the best solutions for different of people, those who can afford, those who can maybe afford, and those who cannot afford in any way electricity. So I think a recognition of these risks really helps to build in solutions that mitigate some of this funding risk. High capital upfront costs and short-term investment focus, you can benefit from subsidies. You have climate funds that provide some of these subsidies as well to reduce the burden of payments and invest on upfront investment costs. And limited public funding as well can be supplemented by climate funds. It can be supplemented by sovereign funds. It can be supplemented by many ways. You know, in Burkina Faso here, where what the government does is that every time you make a call, or every time they have prepaid electricity meters, whenever I charge my meter or I make a call, a portion of that goes into an electricity fund that the government can put back into investing into the country. So recognizing these risks actually gives room for innovative solutions that can actually make a difference in the solutions. So I'll stop there. I know that was a little bit long-winded. I hope I did not lose you guys in the process.
It definitely did not. And I thank you. I thank you for that. Thank you very much for that response. All right. We've successfully gone through all of my questions, but then I have one last question. I have one last question, and I feel like all of our listeners will be excited to hear your take on this. Because I already got like a glimpse into what you're going to say, so I can say it's going to be exciting to hear your response. So we have a teaser question that the show close out. And for today, I would say the teaser question to you would be, if you could go back in time and give your younger self one piece of career advice, what would it be?
Yes, thank you very much. Interesting question. I know we chatted a little bit before we started. So
Yeah.
you guys say it's a teaser, but you already got the teaser. It's something I mentioned to you, something I've been reflecting a lot on recently. And maybe the one thing I will say to my younger self is don't hold back. Don't hold back at all. You know, we have the tendency, especially as young African women, to feel sometimes like our voice doesn't count. We may sometimes feel that we don't belong. We have imposter syndrome sometimes. So I would say to my younger self, Regina, do not hold back. You know, I started out in a very, very junior position, but I had great mentors. I had a solid educational background. It took me time for me to have the confidence to leave jobs and go search for other opportunities, to leave countries and move to other countries to search for opportunities, take my kids and my family and go to explore new adventures. But I wish I did that earlier. You know, I would have saved myself 10 years if I came to that conclusion earlier. So I think I'm very hopeful about the quality of the crop of young women, especially that I see, and even young people generally. People are go-getters. They don't hold back. They don't hesitate. And, you know, it's a generational advantage that you guys have. And I would really, really push that one really takes that into consideration. Whatever, if you can dream it, you can achieve it. We're usually our biggest enemies and we're usually the only factors holding ourselves back. So to my younger self, I would say, Regina, do not hold back. Go for it. So I think maybe that's the big message I would have for myself, and to enjoy the journey more.
Yeah.
I was very, very focused on career, and sometimes I failed to enjoy the journey. I was just so driven that I did not have a lot of fun doing it, but there's so much fun, especially in the energy sector. There's so much fun to be had I can't explain the feeling of going to a community where they tell you what life was like before they had electricity, and when they have a simple thing like electricity. You see kids dancing in the night, and just the joy that all of that brings. So we have to enjoy the journey. We have to realize that what we're doing is not just about a salary. It's not just about making money. It's also about changing lives, and recognizing that early. I think it makes a difference. So yeah, that would be my little spiel on that one.
Oh my God. I'm tempted to say this is my favorite response, but I won't say it because I feel like it's the entire time. But I feel like this is such an important way or an interesting way to wrap up the session, because I'm pretty sure our listeners are already pumped up, because I am, right?
Yeah.
And I totally agree with what you have said. I'm still quite young, I would like to think, but definitely not Gen Z. But I feel like this is such a timely reflection, even for me, because just like you mentioned, as women, sometimes we do hold back. We feel like, let everyone else say their opinions. They have great ideas, but to also recognize that if you're in the room, then you definitely have a great idea as well. And recognizing the fact that we belong where we find ourselves in, we deserve to be there. We're not just there to fill up the room. We have all of the potential and the intelligence to contribute to whatever conversation is going on. And even more importantly, to recognize, just like you said, in your second point, that the work that we do is not just another 9 to 5, but to see the fulfillment that comes from it right from the very start. Like you mentioned, being able to see communities that didn't have simple things as electricity, and how excited they get because now the world is opened up to them. They can now have access to internet, they can have access to technologies, they can keep track with what's going on in the world. And that, I feel like it's really, really fulfilling. It's one of the reasons why I'm excited to be in this profession, because it's definitely fulfilling. So thank you for sharing that. Thank you so much. It's been a wonderful time speaking with you. I'm sure all of our listeners would agree. All of your responses to all of our questions were just spot on, but not just spot on. They gave us a lot of insight into what those questions really were picking at. And I would say that's the general idea of the podcast. And we're excited that you were able to join us today. I'm very, very thankful for your time. Thank you so much, Regina. Thank you very much. Thank you so much. I would wrap up very quickly by saying thank you so much, everyone, for joining us on this particular journey through the incredible life of Miss Regina. I'm sure you enjoyed the series, so don't forget to subscribe, share, and leave a review. Remember, your voice matters too, and just like Regina's, go for it. So stay tuned for more. The Energy Africa Café, shaping Africa's energy future. And until next time, bye-bye.